The black sedan pulled slowly into the parking lot of Evergreen Memorial Chapel, its engine cutting through the hushed reverence that seemed to blanket everything in sight. Inside, Vivian Chun gripped the steering wheel with trembling fingers, her knuckles white against the dark leather. Through the windshield, she could see them already gathering like vultures circling prey. The first wife had arrived early, of course, making sure everyone knew exactly who belonged and who didn't. Take a moment and think about where you're watching this from today. Are you in a place where you've ever felt like an outsider? Maybe somewhere down south where family dynamics run deep, or perhaps up north where old money talks louder than love. Comment below and let me know where you're tuning in from, because this story hits different depending on where you call home. Vivian stepped out into the crisp October air, her simple black dress a stark contrast to the elaborate designer morning where she could see through the chapel windows. She had chosen this dress carefully, the same one Richard had complimented her in just 3 months ago when they'd attended his business partner's retirement dinner. The memory stung now, knowing she would never hear his gentle voice again, never feel his reassuring hand on her shoulder when the world seemed too harsh to bear. The chapel doors opened with a soft whoosh, and Vivian found herself face to face with the life Richard had lived before her. Portraits of him lined the entrance hall, but these weren't the photos from their home. These were older, formal shots where he stood beside a tall, sharp-featured woman with perfectly coiffed platinum hair and eyes like winter steel. Evangeline Fairmont had been Richard's wife for 23 years before their divorce, and she had never let anyone forget it. Evangeline stood near the guest registry, holding court with a group of well-dressed mourners who hung on her every word. Her black Chanel suit probably cost more than most people's cars, and the pearls around her neck caught the light with each gesture she made. She looked every inch the grieving widow, despite the fact that she had been the one to file for divorce 8 years ago. The moment Evangeline's gaze fell on Vivian, her expression shifted from practiced sorrow to barely concealed disdain. She excused herself from her audience with the grace of someone accustomed to command and glided across the marble floor with predatory precision. "Good afternoon," Evangeline said, her voice carrying just enough to ensure others could hear. "I wasn't entirely certain you would come. Funerals can be so complicated when it comes to family arrangements, don't you think?" Vivian felt every eye in the entrance hall turn toward them. She straightened her shoulders and met Evangeline's stare directly. "Richard was my husband," she replied quietly. "Of course I'm here." A perfectly manicured eyebrow arched upward. "Your husband for what? 3 years now." Evangeline's tone suggested she was discussing something distasteful she'd found on her shoe. "I do hope you understand that today is really about Richard's real family. The people who knew him when he was building his empire rather than when he was enjoying its fruits." The words landed like physical blows, but Vivian had learned to weather Evangeline's cruelty over the years. Every family gathering, every social function, every encounter had been marked by these subtle knives wrapped in silk. She nodded politely and moved toward the sanctuary, leaving Evangeline to return to her appreciative audience. The chapel itself was magnificent, all soaring ceilings and stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns across the polished pews. Flower arrangements that must have cost thousands lined the altar, and the mahogany casket gleamed under the soft lighting. This was Richard's final performance, orchestrated entirely by the woman who had walked away from their marriage when his business hit rough waters, but had somehow maintained control over his funeral arrangements. Vivian chose a seat in the third row, close enough to pay her respects, but far enough back to avoid any further confrontations. She watched as Evangeline's adult children filed in, all 3 of them bearing their mother's sharp features and entitled bearing. Marcus, the eldest at 31, wore a suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. His sister Catherine followed, her designer handbag swinging carelessly as she air-kissed the various mourners who approached to offer condolences. The youngest, Bradley, barely looked up from his phone as he took his place in the front row reserved for immediate family. None of them acknowledged Vivian's presence. She might as well have been invisible, just another mourner paying respects to a man they had never really known. The irony wasn't lost on her that these people who treated her like an interloper had barely spoken to Richard in his final years, while she had been the one holding his hand through chemotherapy sessions and sleepless nights of pain. As the service began, Vivian found herself studying the faces around her. Richard's business associates sat in expensive suits, their expressions appropriately somber, but their eyes calculating. She recognized several of them from the company Christmas parties, men who had smiled and laughed with Richard while secretly waiting for him to stumble so they could swoop in and claim pieces of his empire. The pastor spoke eloquently about Richard's accomplishments, his philanthropy, his devotion to family. He painted a picture of a man who had built something lasting, who had touched countless lives through his generosity and vision. It was all true, but it was only part of the truth. Missing from the eulogy was any mention of the man who had taught Vivian to play chess on quiet Sunday mornings, who had surprised her with breakfast in bed when she was stressed about her own business challenges, who had fallen asleep reading mystery novels with his glasses sliding down his nose. When the pastor invited family members to share memories, Evangeline rose gracefully and approached the podium. Her voice carried clearly through the chapel's acoustics as she spoke about their early years together, about watching Richard build his company from nothing, about the traditions they had established and the legacy they had created. Every word was carefully chosen to emphasize her role in his success, while subtly diminishing anything that had come after their divorce. She spoke of family heritage and generational wealth, of values passed down through bloodlines, and the importance of preserving what had been built through decades of sacrifice and dedication. The subtext was clear to everyone present. There were people who belonged to Richard's real legacy, and there were people who had simply been fortunate enough to share his final chapter. When Evangeline returned to her seat, the satisfaction on her face was unmistakable. She had successfully claimed ownership of Richard's memory, positioning herself and her children as the rightful inheritors of everything he had worked to build. Vivian could hear the murmurs of approval from the other mourners, the subtle nods of agreement that confirmed Evangeline's version of events as the official narrative. As the service concluded and mourners began filing toward the reception hall, Vivian remained in her seat for a moment longer. She watched Evangeline accepting condolences like a queen receiving tribute, her children flanking her with the casual arrogance of people who had never questioned their place in the world. Tomorrow would bring the reading of Richard's will, and Vivian had no illusions about what that would reveal. Evangeline had made it clear through her lawyers that any significant inheritance would be contested, that a second wife of only 3 years could hardly expect to benefit from a lifetime of work that had preceded her arrival. The message had been delivered with legal precision. Know your place and don't expect more than token recognition. But as Vivian finally rose and walked toward the reception, there was something in her bearing that suggested she wasn't quite as defeated as Evangeline might have hoped. Her steps were measured but confident, and despite the tears that had fallen during the service, her eyes held a clarity that spoke of someone who knew exactly where she stood, even if nobody else did. The reception hall buzzed with the kind of controlled energy that only comes when wealthy people gather to discuss even wealthier people. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables laden with elaborate catering that had been arranged with military precision. Evangeline moved through the crowd like a seasoned politician, accepting sympathies and dispensing gracious acknowledgments with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades in high society circles. Vivian found herself standing near the window, watching as Evangeline commanded attention from a growing circle of admirers. The conversation had quickly shifted from memories of Richard to discussions of his remarkable business acumen and the empire he had built through sheer determination and visionary thinking. Marcus approached his mother's gathering with the confident stride of someone who had never doubted his place in any room. At 31, he possessed his mother's sharp features but lacked her subtle cunning, preferring the blunt instrument approach to getting what he wanted. He leaned down to whisper something in Evangeline's ear, and she smiled with the satisfaction of someone receiving exactly the news she had been hoping to hear. Of course, the most important thing now is preserving everything Richard worked so hard to build, Evangeline announced to her audience, her voice carrying just enough to reach the neighboring conversations. It would be such a tragedy if his legacy were somehow diminished by poor decisions or misplaced sentimentality. Catherine nodded sagely from her position beside the dessert table, her designer dress catching the light as she gestured with a glass of champagne that probably cost more than most people's weekly groceries. She had inherited her mother's talent for delivering cutting remarks wrapped in silk, though she wielded the skill with less finesse than Evangeline. Family legacy is everything, Catherine declared, her voice pitched to carry across the immediate area. Some people understand the weight of responsibility that comes with inherited wealth, while others simply see opportunity for personal gain. It's really quite sad how some individuals can mistake temporary association for permanent belonging. Bradley, the youngest at 26, barely looked up from his phone but managed to contribute his own observation. 3 years is basically nothing when you're talking about a lifetime of building something meaningful. Dad always said that real family is about shared sacrifice and mutual investment over decades, not just showing up when things are comfortable and established. The words were clearly aimed at Vivian, though none of Richard's children bothered to look in her direction as they spoke. She stood quietly by the window, her expression serene despite the verbal assault being launched from across the room. There was something almost unsettling about her calm demeanor, as if she were listening to a weather report rather than a systematic attack on her character and legitimacy. Judge Harrison Whitfield approached Evangeline's circle with the measured steps of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. He had been Richard's attorney for over 2 decades and had handled the divorce proceedings with surgical precision. His presence at the funeral reception had been noted by everyone present, particularly since he rarely attended social functions unless there were substantial legal implications involved. "Evangeline, my dear," Judge Whitfield said as he kissed her cheek with practiced familiarity, "I trust everything has been arranged to your satisfaction. These situations can be so delicate when there are multiple parties with varying levels of legitimate interest in the proceedings." His words were carefully chosen, the kind of legal speak that managed to convey threats without actually making them. Everyone within earshot understood exactly what he meant. Any attempt by Vivian to claim more than token recognition would be met with swift and overwhelming legal response. "Thank you, Harrison," Evangeline replied with genuine warmth. "It's such a comfort to know that Richard's true family will be protected from any unfortunate misunderstandings about inheritance rights or legal standing. Some people can be so presumptuous when it comes to claiming what was never really theirs to begin with." Judge Whitfield nodded gravely, his expression conveying the weight of legal authority behind Evangeline's words. "The Fairmont Family Trust has been structured very carefully over many years to ensure that Richard's legacy remains with those who truly understand its value and importance. Any challenges to these long-established arrangements would be both unsuccessful and quite costly for the challenging party." The message was clear enough that several nearby conversations paused as people absorbed the implications. Vivian had been effectively put on notice that any attempt to claim a significant portion of Richard's estate would result in a legal battle she could not possibly win. The resources arrayed against her were formidable, and everyone present now understood the dynamics that would play out in tomorrow's will reading. Marcus moved closer to his mother, his voice dropping to what he probably imagined was a whisper, but which carried clearly in the acoustics of the reception hall. "I still can't believe Dad actually went through with marrying her after everything we discussed about protecting the family assets. At least the prenuptial agreement limits any potential damage to the estate's core holdings." Catherine laughed, a sound like champagne glasses breaking on marble. "Oh, Marcus, you're being far too generous. Even with the most ironclad prenuptial agreement, there are always people who think they can find loopholes or claim emotional manipulation. Thank goodness Harrison has everything documented so thoroughly that any such attempts would be laughable in court." The conversation continued in this vein for several more minutes, with each family member contributing their own assessment of Vivian's expected inheritance and their confidence that it would be appropriately minimal. They spoke with the casual cruelty of people who had never been denied anything they wanted, their words designed to humiliate and exclude rather than simply inform. Dr. Patricia Kellerman, Richard's longtime cardiologist, approached Vivian near the window with the kind of determined expression that suggested she had something specific to say. She had been one of the few people who had seen Richard and Vivian together during his illness, and her perspective on their relationship differed significantly from the narrative being constructed across the room. "Vivian, I wanted to express my condolences personally," Dr. Kellerman said quietly. "Richard spoke of you constantly during his treatments. He was so grateful for your support through everything. especially when things became difficult toward the end. "Thank you, Doctor," Vivian replied, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the conversation. "He was a remarkable man, and I feel privileged to have shared his final years." Dr. Kellerman glanced toward Evangeline's gathering before continuing in an even lower tone. "I hope you know that Richard's feelings about his legacy were quite clear to those of us who spent time with him recently. Whatever happens tomorrow, please remember that he valued authenticity and genuine care over social positioning and historical claims." The doctor's words carried a weight that seemed to surprise even Vivian, though she simply nodded graciously and thanked her for the condolence visit. Dr. Kellerman moved away toward the exit, but not before shooting a distinctly disapproving look toward the group still dissecting Richard's assets with gleeful precision. As the reception continued, more conversations began touching on financial matters with increasing boldness. Richard's business partners discussed the company's future direction, his country club associates speculated about real estate holdings, and his investment advisors whispered about portfolio management during the transition period. Every discussion seemed designed to reinforce the assumption that Evangeline and her children would be resuming control of everything Richard had built during their marriage and maintained afterward. Evangeline herself grew more animated as the afternoon progressed, her initial performance of grief giving way to something approaching celebration as she received confirmation after confirmation that her position as Richard's primary heir was understood and accepted by everyone present. She began making veiled references to future plans, charitable foundations that would honor Richard's memory, and family traditions that would continue under her careful stewardship. The most telling moment came when Judge Whitfield's law partner, attorney Margaret Thornton, approached Evangeline with what appeared to be genuine excitement about tomorrow's proceedings. Margaret had handled several high-profile inheritance cases and was known for her ability to navigate complex family dynamics with ruthless efficiency. "I must say, Evangeline, tomorrow should be quite straightforward given how thoroughly Richard documented his intentions over the years," Attorney Thornton observed with professional satisfaction. "It's always refreshing when estate planning has been handled with such attention to proper legal protocols and family hierarchy considerations." Evangeline smiled with the confidence of someone who had never lost a battle that mattered to her. "Richard was always so careful about these things, even during our marriage. He understood the importance of protecting what we had built together from any potential complications that might arise later in life." As the reception began winding down, Vivian remained near the window, still maintaining that same unsettling calm that had marked her behavior throughout the afternoon. She had endured hours of subtle and not-so-subtle attacks on her legitimacy, threats about her legal standing, and predictions about her imminent financial disappointment. Yet there was something in her posture that suggested she was less concerned about tomorrow's will reading than everyone seemed to expect. The last guests began filtering out, offering final condolences and promises to attend the will reading the following morning. Evangeline stood near the door like a receiving line of one, graciously accepting their support for what everyone understood would be her triumphant return to control of Richard's legacy. Vivian gathered her small purse and moved toward the exit, passing close enough to Evangeline's final group of supporters to hear the parting shots that had been saved for her departure. "Some people really should know when they're outmatched," Catherine murmured just loud enough to carry. "Tomorrow morning should provide quite the education in how these things actually work when proper family interests are involved." Vivian paused for just a moment, meeting Catherine's gaze with an expression that was impossible to read. Then she smiled, a small, private smile that seemed to contain knowledge that nobody else in the room possessed, and walked quietly out into the evening air where her car waited in the empty parking lot. The law offices of Davidson, Mitchell and Associates occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown tower that commanded views of the entire business district. Richard had chosen this firm not for their prestigious address, but for their reputation as the kind of lawyers who could navigate the most complex estate planning with surgical precision. Senior partner Edmund Davidson had handled the Fairmont family's legal affairs for over 15 years, and his conference room had witnessed more than its share of family drama played out over inheritance documents. Evangeline arrived precisely 15 minutes early, her black Armani suit perfectly pressed, and her platinum hair arranged in the kind of severe chignon that suggested serious business was about to be conducted. She had chosen the seat at the head of the long mahogany table, positioning herself where Richard himself might have sat during business meetings. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present. Marcus flanked her right side, his expensive suit doing little to disguise the nervous energy that had him checking his phone every few minutes. Catherine sat to Evangeline's left, her designer handbag positioned prominently on the table like a territorial marker. Bradley slouched in the chair next to his sister, his attention divided between his smartphone and the impressive array of legal volumes that lined the conference room walls. Judge Whitfield had positioned himself near the window, his presence adding an extra layer of legal gravitas to the proceedings. His long-time association with the family made him more than just an observer. He was there to ensure that Richard's intentions were carried out exactly as documented, regardless of any emotional appeals that might arise during the reading. Attorney Margaret Thornton sat across from the family, her legal pad already filled with notes from her review of the relevant documents. She had spent the previous evening confirming that every aspect of Richard's estate planning was ironclad, leaving no room for the kind of challenges that sometimes arose when second marriages complicated inheritance matters. Vivian entered the conference room exactly at 10 o'clock, her simple black dress and minimal jewelry creating a stark contrast to the designer-clad family group already assembled. She chose a seat near the far end of the table, close enough to participate, but distant enough to avoid any unnecessary confrontation. Her demeanor remained as mysteriously calm as it had been throughout the funeral proceedings. Mr. Davidson swept into the room with the kind of commanding presence that came from decades of handling high-stakes legal matters. At 68, he moved with the measured confidence of someone who had seen every possible variation of family greed and dysfunction play out across his conference table. His silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses gave him the appearance of a distinguished professor, but his eyes held the sharpness of someone who missed nothing. "Good morning, everyone," Mr. Davidson began as he settled into his chair at the head of the table opposite Evangeline. "I want to thank you all for gathering here today for the formal reading of Richard Thomas Fairmont's last will and testament. Before we begin, I want to emphasize that this document represents Mr. Fairmont's final wishes as expressed through proper legal channels and witnessed according to all applicable state requirements." He opened a thick leather portfolio and removed several documents, arranging them with practiced precision before continuing. "The will I am about to read was executed on March 15th of this year, superseding all previous testamentary documents. Mr. Fairmont was of sound mind and acting without duress when these arrangements were finalized." Evangeline's satisfaction was evident as she settled back in her chair with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what was coming. The March date was particularly significant because it predated any potential influence from Richard's illness, ensuring that his decisions had been made with full mental clarity and without emotional manipulation. Mr. Davidson cleared his throat and began reading from the formal document. "I, Richard Thomas Fairmont, being of sound mind and disposing memory, do hereby make, publish and declare this to be my last will and testament, hereby revoking all wills and codicils heretofore made by me." The opening formalities proceeded exactly as expected, with standard legal language about debts, funeral expenses, and administrative costs being addressed through the estate's general funds. Mr. Davidson's voice carried clearly through the conference room as he detailed the preliminary provisions that established the framework for everything that would follow. "To the American Cancer Society, I bequeath the sum of $50,000 in recognition of their ongoing research efforts and patient support programs. This organization provided valuable assistance during my own health challenges, and I hope this gift will help them continue their important work." Evangeline nodded approvingly at this charitable gesture, which aligned perfectly with the kind of philanthropic legacy she had always encouraged Richard to establish. The amount was substantial enough to reflect well on the family's commitment to worthy causes while being small enough to leave the bulk of the estate available for more important distributions. "To my longtime housekeeper, Maria Santos, who served our family with dedication for over 12 years, I leave the sum of $25,000 and my sincere gratitude for her loyalty and care. Her service extended far beyond professional obligations, and this gift reflects my appreciation for her genuine kindness." Marcus glanced at his watch and shifted impatiently in his chair, clearly eager to move past these preliminary bequests toward the main event. The charitable donations and staff recognition were expected elements, but everyone present was waiting for the reading of the residuary estate provisions that would determine control of Richard's substantial business holdings and personal wealth. To my former business partner, Harold Sean, I leave my collection of first-edition business biographies and the sum of $15,000. Harold's mentorship during the early years of my career was invaluable, and I hope these books will serve as a reminder of the principles we shared about ethical business practices and long-term vision. Catherine examined her perfectly manicured nails while Mr. Davidson continued through the list of smaller bequests to various friends, colleagues, and distant relatives. Each amount was carefully calculated to demonstrate Richard's thoughtfulness without significantly impacting the estate's primary value. The pattern suggested a man who had considered his obligations carefully while preserving the bulk of his wealth for his immediate family. To my dear friend Dr. Patricia Kellerman, who provided not only excellent medical care, but also genuine friendship during my final illness, I leave the sum of $10,000 in my treasured collection of mystery novels. Her compassion extended far beyond professional requirements, and I hope she will think of our discussions whenever she encounters a particularly challenging puzzle. The mention of Dr. Kellerman caused Vivian to look up briefly, her expression unreadable as she processed this unexpected gesture. The doctor had been one of the few people at the funeral who had spoken warmly about Richard and Vivian's relationship, and her inclusion in the will suggested that Richard had valued her perspective on more than just medical matters. Mr. Davidson paused to take a sip of water before continuing, his next words carrying a different weight that caused everyone in the room to pay closer attention. We now come to the matter of my personal effects and household items. To my children Marcus, Catherine, and Bradley, I leave jointly the contents of my study, including my desk, books, and personal memorabilia, with the understanding that they will work together to divide these items according to their individual preferences and sentimental attachments. Evangeline's smile reflected her satisfaction that Richard had maintained appropriate consideration for his children's emotional connection to their childhood home. The study had always been his private sanctuary, and its contents represented decades of business achievement and personal reflection that rightfully belonged with his blood relatives. However, Mr. Davidson continued, his tone shifting subtly, the house itself and all remaining personal property contained therein shall be distributed according to provisions detailed later in this document, which take into account certain circumstances that have developed since my divorce and remarriage. A faint frown crossed Evangeline's features as she processed this unexpected qualification. She had assumed that the house, which had been their family home for over 2 decades, would naturally return to her control as part of the children's inheritance. The reference to circumstances developing since the divorce suggested complications that had not been anticipated in her planning. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, his casual confidence beginning to show signs of strain. Dad always said the house should stay in the family, he said, his voice carrying a hint of uncertainty that had not been present during yesterday's confident predictions about inheritance outcomes. Mr. Davidson looked up from the document with the patient expression of someone who had dealt with premature interruptions countless times before. I would ask that everyone allow me to complete the reading before offering commentary or questions. Mr. Fairmont was very specific about wanting his wishes presented in their entirety before any discussion took place. Catherine's perfectly composed expression showed the first signs of concern as she realized that the predictable distribution of assets might contain unexpected complications. Her mother had assured her that everything had been arranged to protect the family's interests, but Mr. Davidson's carefully neutral tone suggested that Richard's final wishes might not align entirely with their expectations. Continuing with the document, Mr. Davidson said, his voice resuming its formal cadence, "We come now to the matter of the residuary estate, which comprises the bulk of Mr. Fairmont's assets including his business interests, investment portfolios, real estate holdings, and liquid assets totaling approximately $8.7 million. The dollar amount drew sharp attention from everyone present, even though Richard's wealth had been generally known. Hearing the precise figure made the stakes clear and reinforced just how much was about to be decided by the next few paragraphs of legal language. Evangeline straightened in her chair, her expression returning to confident satisfaction as she prepared to hear her children named as the primary beneficiaries of their father's lifetime of work. This was the moment she had been anticipating since Richard's death, the formal recognition of her family's rightful claim to everything he had built during their marriage and maintained afterward. However, Mr. Davidson continued, before addressing the distribution of these assets, I must note that Mr. Fairmont included several codicils to this will that reference documentation contained in his private safe, which was opened in the presence of witnesses following his death. These additional materials significantly impact the distribution of his estate and must be considered as integral parts of his final testament. The word codicils hung in the air like a challenge to everything Evangeline had assumed about Richard's estate planning. Her legal advisors had reviewed the publicly filed documents and found nothing unexpected, but the reference to private safe contents suggested that Richard had maintained certain information outside the normal legal channels. Judge Whitfield shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his expression reflecting the concern of someone who prided himself on comprehensive legal preparation but was now facing unexpected complications. Private safes were notorious for containing surprises that could upend even the most carefully structured estate plans, and Richard had never mentioned any additional documentation during their discussions about inheritance planning. Mr. Davidson reached into his portfolio and withdrew another set of documents, these bearing different letterhead and appearing more recently prepared than the main will. According to the materials found in Mr. Fairmont's private safe, certain assumptions about asset ownership and marital property distribution require substantial modification to ensure accurate legal distribution of his estate. Vivian remained perfectly still in her chair, but something in her posture suggested that unlike everyone else present, she was not surprised by this development. Her calm demeanor had been puzzling throughout the funeral and reception, but now it began to take on a different significance as the first hints of hidden complexity emerged in Richard's final arrangements. The codicils specifically referenced documentation regarding property acquisitions, business investments, and financial transactions that occurred during the past 3 years, Mr. Davidson continued, his voice taking on the careful tone of someone delivering information that would fundamentally alter everyone's understanding of the situation they thought they had been managing. Bradley looked up from his phone for the first time since the reading began, his young face reflecting confusion about why his father would have hidden important financial information from the family's legal advisors. Marcus and Catherine exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to understand that their confident predictions about inheritance outcomes might have been premature. Evangeline's composed expression began showing signs of strain as she realized that the straightforward distribution of Richard's assets might involve complications that her legal team had not anticipated. The reference to the past 3 years was particularly troubling because it covered the entire period of Richard's marriage to Vivian, suggesting that his second wife might have been more involved in his financial affairs than anyone had realized. Before we proceed with reading these additional provisions, Mr. Davidson said, closing the main will document and reaching for the supplementary materials, I want to emphasize that all of this documentation has been verified for authenticity and legal compliance. Mr. Fairmont was very thorough in ensuring that his final wishes would be carried out exactly as he intended, regardless of any assumptions that others might have made about his estate planning priorities. Mr. Davidson arranged the additional documents with the careful precision of someone about to detonate a carefully placed explosive device. The conference room had grown unnaturally quiet, with even Bradley putting away his phone as the gravity of the moment became impossible to ignore. The leather portfolio that had seemed so routine moments earlier now appeared to contain secrets that would reshape everything everyone thought they knew about Richard Fairmont's life and relationships. These supplementary documents, Mr. Davidson began, his voice carrying the weight of revelations that would soon follow, were prepared by Mr. Fairmont working directly with my partner Thomas Mitchell over the past 18 months. They detail financial arrangements and property transactions that significantly predate the March will but were incorporated as binding codicils to ensure legal clarity about asset ownership and distribution rights. Evangeline's perfectly composed expression began showing hairline cracks as she processed the implications of 18 months of secret legal preparation. Richard had been meeting with lawyers and making financial arrangements for a year and a half without informing her or including her legal advisors in any discussions. The careful coordination she had assumed was governing his estate planning had apparently been only the visible surface of much more complex underlying preparations. The first document, dated 14 months ago, establishes a detailed financial timeline of Mr. Fairmont's business recovery following the severe difficulties his company experienced in 2021. Mr. Davidson continued, his tone remaining professionally neutral despite the bombshell nature of the information he was delivering. Marcus straightened in his chair with sharp attention. What business difficulties? He demanded, his voice carrying the edge of someone who was beginning to realize that his understanding of family financial history might be fundamentally flawed. Dad's company was always solid. We never heard about any problems that would require recovery efforts. Mr. Davidson consulted the documents before responding. According to the financial records included in these materials, Fairmont Industries faced bankruptcy proceedings in late 2021 due to a series of failed investments and cash flow problems that threatened the company's survival. The crisis was resolved through an emergency capital infusion that prevented total business collapse and allowed for systematic debt restructuring. The words hit Evangeline like physical blows as she realized that Richard had faced financial catastrophe during their marriage's final year without ever mentioning the severity of the situation. She had filed for divorce assuming that she was leaving a stable financial situation that would provide security for herself and her children, but apparently Richard had been hiding the extent of his business problems even then. Catherine's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "Are you saying Dad was broke when Mother divorced him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because that would mean everything we thought about the settlement and our inheritance is completely wrong." Mr. Davidson turned to the next document in his stack with the measured pace of someone revealing information that would systematically destroy every assumption the family had made about their financial position. The capital infusion that saved Fairmont Industries totaled $2.4 million and was provided through a private loan arrangement that included specific terms for repayment and ongoing business partnership participation. Evangeline found her voice, though it came out strained and uncertain. "Who provided this loan?" she asked, though something in her expression suggested she was beginning to suspect an answer she desperately did not want to hear. The funding was provided by Chun Financial Consulting, a private investment firm owned and operated by Mrs. Vivian Chun Fairmont. Mr. Davidson replied, his words falling into the conference room's silence like stones into still water. Every head turned toward Vivian, who sat quietly at the far end of the table with that same mysteriously calm expression she had maintained throughout the funeral proceedings. For the first time since entering the law offices, she spoke directly to the group assembled around the mahogany table. "Richard came to me in late 2021 when his business was facing bankruptcy," she said, her voice steady and clear. "He had heard through professional networks that I specialized in corporate turnaround financing. We met initially as business associates, nothing more." Judge Whitfield leaned forward with the sharp attention of someone whose legal worldview was being systematically challenged. "Mrs. Fairmont, are you saying that you provided the capital that saved Richard's company before you were married?" he asked, his tone reflecting the careful precision of someone trying to understand how such significant financial arrangements had escaped his knowledge. Vivian nodded calmly. "My firm had been tracking Fairmont Industries as a potential investment opportunity for several months before Richard approached us directly. The company had solid fundamentals, but had made some unfortunate expansion decisions that created short-term liquidity problems. It was exactly the kind of situation my investment strategy was designed to address." Mr. Davidson consulted his documents before continuing. The loan agreement included provisions for Mrs. Chun to take an active role in the company's financial restructuring and strategic planning. Over the following 18 months, her involvement expanded from emergency financing to comprehensive business partnership as the company recovered and began showing substantial profits under the revised operational model. Marcus was staring at Vivian as if seeing her for the first time. "You're telling us that our father's business was saved by her money," he said slowly, his voice reflecting the difficulty of processing information that contradicted everything he had believed about family financial history. "Not just saved, Mr. Davidson clarified, consulting another document. According to the records, Mrs. Fairmont's strategic guidance and additional capital investments increased the company's value by approximately 300% over the past 3 years. Fairmont Industries is now worth significantly more than it was at any point during Mr. Fairmont's previous marriage. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, fundamentally altering the atmosphere in the conference room. Evangeline had based her entire approach to the inheritance on the assumption that she and her children were entitled to wealth that Richard had accumulated during their marriage, but apparently the bulk of his current assets had been generated through a business partnership with the woman she had been systematically humiliating since his death. Catherine's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Mother, did you know about any of this when you filed for divorce?" Evangeline's composure finally cracked completely as she realized that her carefully calculated divorce settlement had been based on a company that was essentially worthless at the time, while the woman she had been treating as an opportunistic second wife had actually been the financial architect of everything valuable that Richard had possessed at his death. Mr. Davidson continued reading from the supplementary documents with the relentless precision of someone whose job was to deliver truth regardless of its emotional impact. The property holdings detailed in these records show that several assets currently assumed to be part of Mr. Fairmont's individual estate are actually jointly owned or solely owned by Mrs. Fairmont through various investment vehicles and corporate partnerships established during their business relationship. Bradley spoke for the first time since the reading began, his young voice cracking slightly under the stress of watching his family's assumptions crumble in real time. "What does that mean exactly?" he asked. "Are you saying she already owns part of everything we thought Dad was leaving to us?" Mr. Davidson retrieved another document that bore the official seal of the county property assessor's office. The family home at 12 Oakwood Manor, which has been the primary residence for Mr. Fairmont's children and was previously owned jointly by Mr. Fairmont and Mrs. Evangeline Fairmont during their marriage, was sold to Chun Financial Properties in 2022 as part of the business restructuring agreement. The words hit the assembled family like a physical force. Evangeline's face went completely white as she processed the information that the house she had been planning to reclaim as part of her children's inheritance had actually been sold to Vivian's investment company 2 years earlier. Mrs. Fairmont has been allowing Mr. Fairmont to continue residing in the property rent-free as part of their personal relationship, but legal ownership transferred to her company when the property was purchased to provide additional capital for business operations, Mr. Davidson explained, his tone remaining professionally neutral despite delivering information that was systematically destroying the financial foundation of everything Evangeline had planned. Vivian spoke again, her voice carrying a gentle firmness that had been completely absent from her demeanor during the funeral humiliation. Richard was struggling with asking for help because he didn't want to burden his children with knowledge of how serious the business problems had become. "I suggested purchasing the house as a way to provide immediate capital while ensuring that he could remain comfortable in familiar surroundings during his recovery period." Judge Whitfield was studying Vivian with the sharp attention of someone whose professional expertise was being challenged by revelations he had never anticipated. "Mrs. Fairmont," he said carefully, "these financial arrangements represent substantial business dealings that typically would involve extensive legal documentation and professional oversight. Are you saying that you managed corporate acquisitions and investment partnerships without working through established legal channels that would have created public records?" Vivian's calm expression took on a subtle edge that suggested depths of competence that nobody in the room had suspected. "Judge Whitfield, I am a certified public accountant with an MBA from Wharton and 22 years of experience in corporate turnaround financing. Chun Financial Consulting has successfully restructured over 40 companies during my career, with a track record that has made my firm one of the most sought-after specialists in emergency business recovery on the West Coast." The revelation of Vivian's credentials hit the conference room like another explosive device. Catherine actually gasped audibly as she realized that the woman they had been dismissing as an opportunistic second wife was actually a highly accomplished business professional whose expertise exceeded anything their family had ever encountered. Mr. Davidson consulted yet another document, his systematic revelation of hidden information continuing to reshape everyone's understanding of the situation they thought they had been managing. Mrs. Fairmont's professional qualifications were verified by Mr. Fairmont's independent legal counsel before any business relationships were established. Her firm's reputation and track record were thoroughly investigated to ensure that any partnership arrangements would be legitimate and beneficial for all parties involved. Marcus was staring at his hands as he processed the complete collapse of every assumption he had made about his father's business success and his family's financial position. So everything Dad built after the divorce, everything we thought was our inheritance, was actually built in partnership with her, he said, his voice reflecting the devastation of someone watching their worldview disintegrate in real time. Not just in partnership, Mr. Davidson clarified, consulting the increasingly damaging documents. According to the financial records, Mrs. Fairmont's capital investments and strategic guidance were the primary factors enabling the business recovery. Without her intervention, Fairmont Industries would have been dissolved through bankruptcy proceedings, leaving no assets for anyone to inherit. Evangeline found her voice again, though it came out strained and desperate. "This doesn't make sense," she said, grasping for any explanation that might preserve some portion of her carefully constructed plans. "Richard never mentioned any business problems when we were married. He never said anything about needing outside financial assistance." Vivian looked directly at Evangeline for the first time since the reading began, her expression compassionate but unflinching. "Richard was protecting you from information that would have been devastating to hear during an already difficult divorce process. He asked me specifically not to mention our business relationship because he didn't want you to worry about financial security for yourself and the children during the settlement negotiations." The kindness in Vivian's voice made the revelation even more devastating as Evangeline realized that Richard's apparent financial stability during their divorce had been an illusion maintained to protect her from worse news, and that the woman she had been systematically attacking had actually been the architect of her family's continued financial security. Mr. Davidson reached for the final document in his supplementary collection, his movements suggesting that the most significant revelations were still to come. "However, before we proceed with the specific inheritance distributions detailed in Mr. Fairmont's final will, there is one additional matter that must be addressed regarding the circumstances that led to the dissolution of Mr. Fairmont's first marriage." Judge Whitfield straightened in his chair with the alertness of someone sensing legal complications that could affect everything that had already been discussed. "Mr. Davidson," he said carefully, "I hope you're not suggesting that there were irregularities in the divorce proceedings that I oversaw personally." Mr. Davidson's expression remained diplomatically neutral as he opened the final document. "Not irregularities in the legal process, Your Honor, but previously unknown information about the events that precipitated the divorce filing, which Mr. Fairmont chose not to disclose at the time in order to protect all parties involved, but which he felt should be documented as part of his final testament." Evangeline's face went from white to gray as she realized that Richard's carefully maintained silence about their marriages and might be about to give way to revelations she had assumed would remain permanently buried. Her confident legal positioning was beginning to look less like shrewd preparation and more like elaborate self-deception based on incomplete information about her own history. Mr. Davidson opened the final document with the solemnity of someone about to deliver a verdict that would reshape lives permanently. The conference room had become a battlefield of shattered assumptions, and the last revelation would determine which version of reality would govern the distribution of Richard Fairmont's substantial legacy. According to a private letter Mr. Fairmont left to be read as part of these proceedings, Mr. Davidson began, his voice carrying the weight of words that had been carefully chosen to deliver maximum clarity with minimal cruelty. The end of his first marriage was precipitated by Mrs. Evangeline Fairmont's extramarital relationship with Judge Harrison Whitfield, which had been ongoing for approximately 18 months before the divorce filing. The words detonated in the conference room like a precisely placed explosive charge. Judge Whitfield's face went ashen as he realized that his presence at the will reading had just transformed from professional courtesy into public exposure of behavior that could destroy his judicial career and social standing. Evangeline sat frozen in her chair, her carefully constructed facade of righteous widow completely demolished by the revelation of secrets she had assumed would never surface. Richard chose not to contest the divorce or seek punitive damages despite having documentation of the affair. Mr. Davidson continued, consulting the letter with professional detachment, because he felt that exposing the relationship publicly would be harmful to his children and would not serve any constructive purpose in moving forward with his life. Marcus looked from his mother to Judge Whitfield with the expression of someone watching his entire understanding of family history collapse in real time. He had spent years believing that his mother had been the wrong party in the divorce, the faithful wife abandoned for a younger woman. But now he was learning that she had been the one conducting secret relationships while married to his father. Catherine's perfectly applied makeup could not disguise the devastation spreading across her features as she processed the implications of her mother's deception. Every conversation about family values and proper behavior, every criticism of Vivian's legitimacy, had been delivered by someone whose own conduct had violated the very principles she claimed to represent. However, Mr. Davidson continued, his systematic destruction of Evangeline's position proceeding with legal precision. Mr. Fairmont did document the financial impact of the affair on his business operations, specifically noting that Mrs. Fairmont had shared confidential company information with Judge Whitfield, which subsequently influenced several legal decisions that cost Fairmont Industries substantial revenue during the divorce proceedings. Judge Whitfield found his voice, though it came out strained and defensive. Mr. Davidson, I must object to these allegations being presented without proper legal context or opportunity for response. These claims represent serious accusations about judicial impropriety that require formal investigation through appropriate channels. Mr. Davidson looked up from the document with the patient expression of someone who had anticipated exactly this response. Your Honor, Mr. Fairmont specifically requested that this information be presented only as context for his inheritance decisions, not as the basis for any legal action. He felt that the truth should be documented, but that pursuing justice through the courts would cause more harm than benefit to everyone involved. Vivian spoke for the first time since her professional credentials had been revealed, her voice carrying a gentle authority that had been completely absent during her earlier humiliation. Richard never wanted to hurt anyone with these revelations, she said, her words directed toward the increasingly devastated children. He asked me to ensure that if these facts ever needed to be shared, they would be presented with compassion for everyone affected by difficult circumstances. Bradley stared at his mother with the expression of someone whose fundamental trust in authority figures had just been shattered. Mom, he said, his young voice cracking under the emotional weight of the revelations, did you really have an affair with Judge Whitfield while you were married to Dad? Evangeline's response came out as barely more than a whisper, her decades of confident superiority reduced to desperate damage control. There were complications in our marriage that you children were too young to understand, she said, grasping for any explanation that might salvage some portion of her moral authority. Sometimes adults make difficult decisions when relationships become impossible to maintain. Mr. Davidson returned to the primary will document with the air of someone who had delivered all necessary context and was now ready to proceed with the main event. With this background information established, we can now address the specific distribution of Mr. Fairmont's residuary estate, totaling $8.7 million. The dollar amount refocused everyone's attention on the immediate practical consequences of all the revealed information. Despite the emotional devastation of the family secrets being exposed, substantial wealth was still about to be distributed, and the beneficiaries had yet to be formally identified. To my former wife, Evangeline Fairmont, Mr. Davidson read, his voice carrying Richard's words across the wreckage of her carefully maintained reputation. I leave the sum of $1 and my sincere hope that she will find happiness in her relationship with Judge Whitfield, which I hope will prove more faithful than our marriage was. The symbolic nature of the bequest hit Evangeline like a physical blow. $1 was the legal minimum required to acknowledge someone in a will while making it clear that their exclusion from substantial inheritance was completely intentional. Richard had ensured that she could never claim to have been forgotten accidentally, while simultaneously making his feelings about her conduct unmistakably clear. To my children Marcus, Catherine, and Bradley, I leave my love and the hope that they will understand that their inheritance was compromised not by my decisions, but by their mother's choices during our marriage, Mr. Davidson continued, the devastating precision of Richard's final message continuing to reshape the family's understanding of their financial situation. Marcus interrupted with desperation creeping into his voice. What does that mean exactly? He demanded. Are we being cut out of the inheritance because of what Mother did? Mr. Davidson consulted the document before responding. Your father established trust funds for each of you when you were children, funded through regular contributions throughout your lives. However, according to financial records included in these materials, Mrs. Fairmont accessed these trust funds during the divorce proceedings and used the money to purchase property and investments in her own name. Catherine's face went completely white as she realized that her mother had not only destroyed the family through her affair, but had also stolen the children's inheritance to finance her post-divorce lifestyle. The comfortable financial position she had enjoyed since the divorce had been funded by money that was rightfully theirs. Mr. Davidson reached the final provision of the will, his voice carrying Richard's ultimate decision about the distribution of everything he had built during his lifetime. To my beloved wife, Vivian Chin Fairmont, who saved my business, rebuilt my life, and showed me that partnership means supporting each other through difficulties rather than abandoning ship when troubles arise, I leave the entirety of my residuary estate. The words settled over the conference room like a final verdict on everything that had transpired since Richard's death. Vivian would inherit not just Richard's wealth, but also his business, his property holdings, and his legacy as someone who had built something lasting through honest effort and genuine partnership. Additionally, Mr. Davidson continued, Mr. Fairmont has established a charitable foundation in Mrs. Fairmont's name, funded with an additional $2 million to provide emergency business financing for small companies facing bankruptcy. This foundation will ensure that Mrs. Fairmont's expertise in corporate recovery continues to help other families avoid the kind of financial devastation that threatened the Fairmont family in 2021. Vivian's eyes filled with tears for the first time during the entire proceedings, not from grief, but from recognition of how completely Richard had understood and valued her contributions to rebuilding his life. The foundation represented not just wealth, but validation of her life's work, and a means to continue helping others facing the same challenges Richard had overcome. Evangeline found her voice one final time, though it came out as a broken whisper. This can't be legal, she said, grasping desperately for any possible avenue to challenge what had just occurred. There must be grounds for contesting these provisions based on undue influence or emotional manipulation. Judge Whitfield remained silent, his ability to provide legal support for Evangeline's position completely compromised by the exposure of their relationship and its impact on previous legal proceedings. Attorney Margaret Thornton looked uncomfortable as she realized that any challenge to the will would inevitably expose her clients to further humiliation when the documented evidence of the affair became public record. Mr. Davidson closed the will document with the finality of someone whose job had been completed exactly as intended. The will has been properly executed according to all legal requirements, he said, his tone indicating that the proceedings were concluded. Mrs. Fairmont now has full legal authority over the estate and all associated properties, including the family home, which she already owned through her business investments. Vivian stood gracefully, her transformation from humiliated funeral attendee to estate inheritor complete in the span of one morning. She looked around the conference room at the devastated faces of people who had spent the previous day confidently predicting her financial disappointment and social exclusion. I want you to know that despite everything that has happened, she said, her voice carrying genuine compassion for the children who had just watched their world collapse, Richard loved all of you very much. The door will always be open if you want to maintain a relationship built on honesty rather than assumptions about who deserves what from whom. With that, she gathered her small purse and walked quietly toward the conference room door, leaving behind a family whose carefully constructed version of reality had been completely demolished by the truth they had never bothered to investigate. 3 weeks after the will reading that had changed everything, Vivian stood in the sunlit kitchen of the Oakwood Manor home, preparing tea for visitors she had never expected to receive. Marcus had called the previous evening, his voice tentative and stripped of the arrogance that had characterized all their previous interactions. He had asked, almost shyly, if he and his siblings could come by to collect some personal items from their father's study and perhaps talk about moving forward in a way that honored Richard's memory. The transformation in the house itself was subtle but unmistakable. Fresh flowers filled vases that had stood empty during Richard's final illness, and the heavy curtains that had kept the rooms dim and somber had been opened to let natural light flood the spaces where he had spent his last months. Vivian had been careful not to erase the family history embedded in every room, but her presence had brought a warmth that had been missing during the years of Richard's isolation and decline. When the doorbell rang, Vivian opened it to find three people who bore little resemblance to the confident inheritors who had dismissed her so casually at the funeral reception. Marcus stood with shoulders that seemed to have lost their military precision, his expensive suit replaced by simple slacks and a sweater that made him look younger and more vulnerable than his 31 years. Catherine's designer armor had given way to jeans and a modest blouse, her perfect makeup reduced to a natural look that revealed the genuine sadness in her eyes. Bradley, no longer hidden behind his phone, met her gaze directly for the first time since she had known him. "Please come in," Vivian said gently, stepping aside to welcome them into what had once been their childhood home but was now legally hers. "I've prepared some of your father's favorite tea, if you'd like some while we talk." The offer of hospitality, so simple and natural, seemed to affect all three siblings more deeply than any grand gesture might have. They had expected coldness, perhaps even vindictive triumph from the woman who had inherited everything they had assumed would be theirs. Instead, they found genuine warmth from someone who seemed to understand their loss more clearly than they had understood it themselves. Marcus spoke first, his voice lacking any trace of the entitled demeanor that had marked all his previous interactions with Vivian. "We wanted to apologize for how we treated you at the funeral and reception," he said, his words careful and sincere. "We had no idea about what you had done for Dad or what Mother had done to the family. We were operating on completely wrong information." Catherine nodded, her perfectly controlled composure replaced by raw honesty that made her seem more human than she had ever appeared before. "We spent years believing a story that wasn't true," she added. "Mother told us that Dad had abandoned us for a younger woman, but we know now that she was the one who destroyed the marriage. We're sorry for blaming you for things that had nothing to do with you." Vivian poured tea for each of them, her movements graceful and unhurried despite the emotional weight of the conversation. "Your father never wanted you to know about your mother's affair because he felt it would hurt you unnecessarily," she said, her voice carrying the gentle authority that had emerged since the truth about her background had been revealed. "He protected you from painful information even when doing so made him look like the villain in your eyes." Bradley, who had been silent throughout most of their previous encounters, finally found his voice. "Is it true that Mom stole our trust fund money?" he asked, his young face reflecting the difficulty of accepting that the person who was supposed to protect him had been the one causing the most damage. Vivian set down her teacup carefully before answering. "The trust funds your father established were accessed during the divorce proceedings, but the money was used to purchase assets that your mother believed would provide security for her future. I don't think she intended to steal from you so much as she panicked about her financial situation and made some poor decisions." The compassionate explanation of their mother's behavior demonstrated a generosity of spirit that none of the siblings had expected from someone who had been so cruelly treated by their family. Vivian could have been vindictive, could have emphasized their mother's betrayal and greed, but instead she offered understanding for the fear and desperation that had driven Evangeline's choices. Marcus leaned forward with the expression of someone grappling with a fundamental question about his future. "What happens to us now?" he asked. "I mean, we understand that you don't owe us anything, but we're trying to figure out how to rebuild relationships that were based on lies for so many years." Vivian smiled with genuine warmth, her response revealing the depth of thought she had given to this exact question. "Your father left specific instructions about his hopes for your futures," she said. "He wanted me to offer each of you opportunities to prove that you could build something meaningful through your own efforts rather than simply inheriting wealth you hadn't earned." She reached for a folder that had been sitting on the kitchen counter, her movements suggesting that this conversation had been planned rather than spontaneous. "I'm prepared to offer Marcus a position with the business development team at one of my investment companies, where he can learn about corporate recovery and earn advancement based on his performance. Catherine, I understand you have a degree in marketing that you've never really used. There's a position available with our charitable foundation where you could develop programs to help families in financial crisis. The offers represented something none of the siblings had experienced in their lives: the opportunity to earn recognition and security through actual work rather than inherited privilege. The prospect was both terrifying and oddly liberating for people who had never been challenged to prove their worth through personal achievement. And Bradley, Vivian continued, addressing the youngest sibling directly, your father mentioned that you had been interested in studying business before you got distracted by the comfortable lifestyle that family wealth provided. I'm willing to fund your education completely, including graduate school if you're serious about building a career in business management or corporate finance. The generosity of the offers left all three siblings speechless for several minutes as they processed the reality that the woman they had dismissed and humiliated was prepared to invest in their futures despite having every reason to exclude them permanently from her life. Catherine was the first to find her voice, tears making tracks down her cheeks as she struggled to express gratitude she had never expected to need. Why would you do this for us? She asked. After everything we said and did, why would you give us chances we don't deserve? Vivian's answer revealed the fundamental difference between her character and that of the family that had rejected her. Because your father loved you, and because everyone deserves the opportunity to become better than they were yesterday, she said simply. I'm not interested in perpetuating cycles of hurt and exclusion. I'd rather invest in the possibility that people can learn and grow from their mistakes. The conversation continued for another hour as practical details were discussed, and tentative plans were made for the siblings to begin rebuilding their lives on foundations of honest effort rather than inherited entitlement. When they finally prepared to leave, each carrying boxes of personal items from their father's study, the atmosphere in the house had shifted completely from the painful tension that had marked their previous interactions. As Vivian walked them to the door, Marcus turned back with a question that had clearly been weighing on his mind throughout their visit. What's happening with Mother? He asked. We haven't spoken to her since the will reading, and we're not sure how to handle that relationship going forward. Vivian's expression grew thoughtful as she considered how to address the complicated situation of Evangeline's complete social and financial collapse. Your mother is facing the consequences of choices she made over many years, she said carefully. Judge Whitfield has distanced himself from her to protect his judicial career, and most of her social circle has withdrawn support since the truth about the affair became known. She's living in a small apartment downtown and working as a sales associate at a department store. The image of their formerly imperious mother reduced to retail work in order to pay basic living expenses was sobering for all three siblings, but especially for Bradley, who had relied most heavily on her guidance and support throughout his young life. Vivian continued with the same gentle firmness that had marked all her interactions since the truth had been revealed. I won't tell you how to handle your relationship with her, but I would suggest that any reconciliation be based on honest acknowledgement of what happened rather than pretending that the past can be ignored. People can change, but only if they first accept responsibility for the harm they've caused. 6 months later, Vivian stood in the beautifully renovated conference room of the Chin Fairmont Recovery Foundation, preparing for the ribbon-cutting ceremony that would formally launch Richard's Memorial Charitable Organization. The room was filled with small business owners, community leaders, and financial professionals who had come to celebrate the opening of a foundation that would provide exactly the kind of emergency assistance that had saved Richard's company during its darkest hour. Marcus, Catherine, and Bradley stood together near the front of the room, their presence representing the successful transformation of three people who had earned their places through genuine effort rather than inherited privilege. Marcus had proven himself exceptional at identifying struggling companies that could benefit from recovery assistance. Catherine had developed outreach programs that were already helping dozens of families navigate financial crises with dignity and hope. Bradley had returned to school with the focus and determination of someone who had finally discovered genuine purpose in his life. In the back of the room, almost unnoticed among the other attendees, Evangeline sat quietly in a simple dress that suggested her circumstances had changed dramatically since the funeral reception where she had held court like a queen receiving tribute. She had reached out to Vivian several weeks earlier, asking not for financial assistance, but for the opportunity to volunteer with families who were facing the kind of devastating choices that financial crisis could create. Her experience of losing everything had given her a perspective that was proving valuable in helping others navigate similar difficulties with greater wisdom than she had shown in her own situation. As Vivian spoke about Richard's legacy and the Foundation's mission to transform financial crisis into opportunity for growth and renewal, her words carried the authority of someone who had lived through every challenge the organization was designed to address. She had proven that it was possible to rebuild from complete devastation, to turn betrayal and loss into wisdom and generosity, and to create something lasting and meaningful from the wreckage of other people's failures. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a portrait of Richard that would hang permanently in the Foundation's main lobby, showing him not as the successful businessman he had been during his first marriage, but as the man he had become during his recovery. Someone who had learned that true strength came not from accumulated wealth, but from the courage to accept help when it was needed and the wisdom to extend that same help to others facing similar challenges. As the guests filtered out into the evening air, Vivian remained in the conference room for a few moments, looking at Richard's portrait and feeling the deep satisfaction that comes from honoring someone's memory through actions rather than words. She had inherited his wealth, but more importantly, she had inherited his commitment to using success as a means of lifting others rather than simply accumulating advantages for herself. The journey from humiliated funeral attendee to respected community leader had taken less than a year, but it represented the culmination of everything Vivian had learned about resilience, compassion, and the power of quiet dignity in the face of cruelty and injustice. She had won not by destroying her enemies, but by transforming them into allies, creating a legacy that honored the best possibilities of human nature rather than simply punishing the worst.